Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of Side Projects. This one's all about the world's deadliest construction projects, because for some reason when things collapse and people die, you guys watch the videos more. So yay! Featuring a horrific rate of 408 deaths per 1,000 workers from the construction fatality standpoint, the Panama Canal is in a class by itself. Nearly 31,000 souls lost their lives toiling on the project. But compared to others like the Suez Canal that had a far larger workforce, in terms of absolute deaths, its numbers are relatively small. Not surprisingly, in the past century, safety often took a back seat to expediency and profit, but as early as the 1800s, some forward-thinking engineers and construction companies began taking the lives of their workers seriously. It's like, why didn't we do that from day one? Apparently they were disposable. When the Eiffel Tower was built in the 1880s and 1890s, official records show that no construction-related deaths occur, a statistic largely attributed to the pioneering use of safety nets and guardrails. Likewise, when the 984-foot, 300-meter Art Deco Chrysler Building was erected in New York in the 20s and 30s, of 3,000 workers, none of them died. But though significant advancements have been made over the years, construction's still a deadly trade. Even now, workers die from falling debris, collapsing cranes, asphyxiation, and faulty or non-existent safety equipment. But at least in the developed world, gone are the days of casualties caused by malaria, malnourishment, hostile natives, and predatory beasts like leopards, lions, and tigers. If you're working on a construction project where you're going to get killed by a tiger, that's a bad time. So let's dive into some of the world's deadliest construction projects. The Suez Canal is a man-made channel stretching across Egypt's Suez Isthmus between Africa and Asia. Extending from Port Tufik in the south to Port Said in the north, the canal is more than 120 miles long, that's 193 kilometers from end to end, and on average carries more than 90 vessels per day, or 32,000 per year. God damn, 90 per day is 32,000 a year? The year is really long. It provides commercial and military ships a direct route between the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea and the Mediterranean and the North Atlantic, thereby reducing trip length between Middle Eastern, African, Asian, and European ports by as much as 5,500 miles, that's 8,900 kilometers. Employing nearly 1.5 million workers from around the world, the colossal project claimed the lives of more than 120,000 souls, making it one of the deadliest construction projects in history. In the mid-1850s, after years of lobbying Egyptian and Sudanese officials and royalty, French diplomat Ferdinand de Lesseps was granted a concession to build a massive canal that would be open to vessels of all nations. Before construction began, however, an international commission of experts was to establish and determine the project's feasibility, cost, and route. They kind of put the cart a little bit before the horse then, didn't they? It's like, yeah, you could definitely build it, but is it actually possible? I don't know if it's possible. When ground was broken in September of 1859, much of the digging was done by pick and shovel wielding laborers, most of whom were working against their wills. Progress was painfully slow early on thanks to nearly impenetrable bedrock, outbreaks of malaria, labor disputes, lack of satisfactory food and water, harsh weather, and abominable living conditions. But when Egypt's Khedive Ismail Pasha banned the use of forced labor in 1683, it forced the Suez Canal Company to make a shift to mechanized construction rather than paying their workers. Come on, guys. Which eventually included hundreds of steam and coal-powered earth movers like shovels and dredges. In fact, it was just the shot that the project needed. Progress that had been anemic increased rapidly, and all told, the lion's share of the 75 million cubic meters of earth, rock, and sand moved was done by machinery. When it opened in October of 1869, the single-lane canal was just 25 feet deep, that's 7.6 meters, and tapered from only 72 feet, 22 meters wide at the bottom, to between 200 and 300 feet, 61 to 91 meters wide on the surface. There were no locks like there are today, and since the seawater flowed freely, the level changed with prevailing tides, which meant crossings were often hairy for heavily laden ships. The canal's final cost came in at nearly $100 million, or nearly twice what was estimated, which still sounds like an absolute bargain, until you consider inflation, which puts the price somewhere between $7 and $10 billion, perhaps more. It's hard to work out exact conversions when we go back that far in time and to different countries. Construction of the Burma-Siam Railway between Bangkok, Thailand and Morlam, Myanmar, formerly Burma, claimed the lives of more than 30,000 civilians and POWs. In the opening months of the war in the Pacific, Japanese forces struck Allied bases in the Dutch East Indies, Singapore, the Philippines and Hong Kong, and by the spring of 1942, they had captured nearly 130,000 civilians and 150,000 soldiers, including 30,000 Brits, 18,000 Dutchmen, 13,000 Australians, and about 700 Americans. Remarkably even numbers that they captured. Shortly thereafter, when the Imperial Japanese Navy was defeated in the Battle of the Coral Sea, the embattled country's supply routes became hopelessly insecure, and new ways of getting goods to forces in Southeast Asia were desperately needed. Despite abundant drawbacks, an overland route through some of the region's densest jungles and most mountainous terrain was the best alternative, and to that end, scores of prisoners were crammed into vessels known as hell ships bound for Thailand and Burma, a perilous journey during which nearly 20% of those on board died. Between June 1942 and October 1943, POWs and forced laborers, including children, laid nearly 260 miles of track along the River Kwai. The narrow-gauge track required numerous bridges and significant portions of mountain to be carved away, and most of the work was done by hand, one painstaking swing of the pick at a time. The route wound its way through abundant canyons and gorges, the most treacherous of which became known as Hellfire Pass, and that included cuts as long as 1,500 feet, 450 meters, that bore more than 200 feet, 61 meters, into rock. In addition to abysmal conditions in camp, workers endured heavy rains, blistering heat, thick banks of disease-carrying mosquitoes, 18-hour days, and constant beatings, and daily rations included little more than token portions of rice and spoiled meat or fish, often contaminated with maggots and rat excrements. Consequently, exposure, malnourishment, dehydration, cholera, malaria, and diarrhea were common and frequently led to death. Some historians believe that more than 12,000 Allied POWs died during construction, and possibly 3 or 4 times as many civilians. Most were left where they fell or buried in mass graves deep in the jungle in areas that are still relatively inaccessible. Now the remains of nearly 7,000 Allied soldiers are interred on the grounds of the Kanchanaburi War Cemetery. The adjacent museum draws nearly 100,000 visitors annually. A semi-man-made waterway between Lake Niger and the White Sea had been on the drawing board long before construction officially began in 1931. The proposed White Sea-Baltic Sea Canal would reduce transit times and shipping costs between Russia, Finland, and the Baltic countries, but all previous attempts at building it were abandoned due to a lack of funding and insufficient economic necessity, namely that existing railroads were able to handle much of the cargo moving into and out of the area. But plans for a canal retook center stage in the early 1930s when, by decree of the Council of Labor and Defense of the USSR and Joseph Stalin himself, construction was ordered to begin once again. We know that when Stalin says something has to be done, it's going to be done, or people are going to die. Although with Stalin, people are going to die anyway. Just a few years earlier, in late 1927, Stalin had launched the Revolution from Above that set 2 distinct goals for the country: agricultural collectivization and a massive push towards industrialization, the latter of which included scores of transportation projects. Stretching 141 miles, 227 kilometers from end to end, only about a third of the canal would be man-made. The rest would follow the course of existing rivers and lakes, of which Lake Vigo Zero is the largest. Work on the canal was, unsurprisingly, almost exclusively carried out by forced labor from gulags, many of whom had been convicted of political crimes, while others were guilty of little more than owing money to creditors, petty theft, and public drunkenness. According to official records, the workforce totaled 125,000, of which between 12 and 25,000 died from exposure, starvation, malnutrition, and simple physical exhaustion. Other unofficial sources, like dissident author Alexander Solzhenitsyn, suggest that the real numbers may have been up to 10 times higher, and that massive graves found in the forests around Sandamark offer proof of mass executions, probably of prisoners no longer fit for hard labor. Despite the unthinkable conditions, the canal and its 19 locks were built in less than 2 years and opened ahead of schedule on August 2, 1933. Not surprisingly, however, the workmanship was poor even by Soviet standards, and due to money and time constraints, at just 11.5 feet, that's 3.5 meters deep in some areas, the canal was much shallower than the planned depth of 17.7 feet or 5.4 meters. This makes it impassable for nearly all ocean-going vessels, including submarines and Navy ships traveling between the Barents, White, and Baltic Seas, for which some historians theorize it was actually built in the first place. The canal was damaged extensively during World War II, and though a number of upgrades have been made over the years, it still only sees light traffic, mostly from relatively small freighters. At more than 1,900 miles, America's Transcontinental Railroad was built with unprecedented speed between 1863 and 1869. I've actually done an entire video on it's fascinating that the whole Transcontinental Railroad is fascinating on Geographics, another channel that I do. When you're done with this one, be sure to check it out. And with an official fatality rate of 80 deaths per 1,000 workers, it wasn't a particularly safe place to be employed. It's almost a 1 in 10 chance of death, and this isn't some gulag situation. In fact, the railroad was built almost entirely without the heavy construction equipment we take for granted today. Instead, millions of tons of rock were moved by workers with picks, shovels, augers, and copious amounts of black powder and dynamite. Though the total number of workers employed on the project isn't known, it's generally agreed that about 15,000 Chinese and as many as 2,000 Irish immigrants provided most of the labor, and about 1,200 of them died as a result. 3 decades before construction began, the steam locomotive made its debut along the country's heavily populated east coast, and just a few decades later, nearly 10,000 miles, 16,100 kilometers of track had been laid. That said, visions of westward expansion loomed large in the minds of many American farmers, prospectors, and opportunistic captains of industry looking to cash in on the impending migration. But in the mid-19th century, the overland journey from east to west was prohibitively laborious and risky, and many pioneers succumbed to disease, starvation, exposure, and attacks from hostile Native Americans across the Great Plains and Southwest. The only other feasible routes were across the Isthmus of Panama and around South America's Cape Horn, both of which were even more expensive, time-consuming, and also deadly. In short, an alternative was needed, and it was needed rather quickly. In 1845, New York entrepreneur Asa Whitney proposed the idea for a new national railroad to Congress, but years of lobbying failed to secure the necessary approval until President Abraham Lincoln finally signed the Pacific Railroad Act into law in 1862. 2 private companies, the Central Pacific and Union Pacific Railroads, would race towards one another from starting points in Sacramento, California and Omaha, Nebraska, respectively, and if all went according to plan, they'd meet somewhere in the middle, thereby opening up the West. The companies were to be heavily rewarded for every mile of track built, which promoted speed and profits over more trivial matters like quality and safety. All told, the primary causes of death during construction were rockslides, premature explosions, falls from high places, and malnourishment, as well as outbreaks of diseases like smallpox. Other more colorful, yet less numerous deaths occurred at settlements that popped up all along the railroad's route, in which gambling, prostitution, drinking, and playing with firearms were the main forms of recreation. Drinking, prostitution, gambling, and playing with firearms, how about that? Nonetheless, the 2 railroads met in Utah on the 10th of May, 1869 for the Golden Spike Ceremony, marking the official end of construction. In all, 690 miles, that's 1,110 kilometers of track had been laid from Sacramento, and another 1,747 kilometers from Omaha. Total cost probably exceeded $100 million, or between $3 and $4 billion in today's money. Stretching nearly 800 miles, 1,300 kilometers, between Pakistan's Punjab province to the south and Xinjiang, China to the north, the Karakoram Highway, also known as KKH, and the China-Pakistan Friendship Highway, passes through some of the region's most rugged and remote landscapes. Funded and built by the 2 partner countries, much of the highway follows the route of the original Silk Road that's often just a few hours from other neighboring nations like Tajikistan and Afghanistan. Though the highway's purported aim was economic development, it's militarily significant as well, particularly with respect to moving supplies and troops to the perennially volatile Kashmir region between India and Pakistan. Construction began in 1959, but was preceded by years of planning and negotiations, much of which concerns the highway's proposed route, which was often hotly contested due to far-ranging issues including cost, ease of construction, the preservation of natural areas and archaeological sites, and susceptibility to airstrikes should regional war break out during construction. You gotta be prepared. Winding its way through vast glacier fields and dozens of towering mountains like Pakistan's 26,600-foot Nanga Parbat, construction was slow, it was expensive, and it was prone to abundant dangers resulting from engineering miscalculations, mechanical mishaps, and, of course, dynamite blasts. There were also natural forces like earthquakes, high winds, and flash floods. The project employed nearly 25,000 workers, including unskilled laborers and heavy equipment operators, engineers, hydrologists, geologists, all sorts. They were employed by private companies and the governments of both countries. The impressive engineering feat resulted in one of the world's highest paved roads that in some areas near the Kunjara Pass is more than 15,000 feet above sea level. Hence, like many large projects around the globe, it's often referred to as the eighth wonder of the world. Estimates of construction-related deaths range from just over 500 to more than 2,000, while other sources claim both countries either intentionally underreported fatalities or just failed to prioritize accurate record keeping. I mean, what would be the possible motivation for doing that? Whatever the case, it's believed the Pakistani fatalities were 3 or 4 times greater than they were for the Chinese, most likely due to less advanced construction methods and safety precautions, and because at 501 miles, 806 kilometers, the portion of the highway in Pakistan is significantly longer than the Chinese section. Since it opened in 1979, much of the highway has remained unpaved, and maintenance crews struggle to deal with gargantuan potholes and huge swaths of missing road caused by seasonal landslides, avalanches, and floods. Even now, approximately 300 deaths occur on the highway annually, most of which are the result of trucks and buses plummeting off precipices or being buried by falling debris. That is a terrifying statistic. Though in absolute deaths its numbers are relatively low, at 55 fatalities per 1,000 workers, unofficially, the KKH was another of the world's deadliest construction projects. So I'm not going to ask whether you enjoyed that video today because we just talked about people dying while building things, but I do hope you found it interesting, informative, all of that good stuff. If you did, please do give it a thumbs up below. Don't forget to subscribe, and as always, thank you for watching.